Hi, and welcome to the Tuesday live stream. This was completely not planned, but today we're talking about presuppositionalism. I've got Dr. Josh Rasmussen on with me, and we're talking about, well, how do we know anything? Do we need to presuppose God's existence? But first, let me explain why we're doing this. So the reason why we're doing this stream is because Josh is in a contest right now, if you want to call it a contest, with Cy10 Bruggencate on Twitter. And the reason why we're doing this is because we want to promote Josh's work, and the more people that vote for him, the better. The more people know about him. I think that his work is really, really important. His work on the existence of God, the contingency argument, so important. So please go vote for Josh so that he can beat Cy. And this is not a battle between the two and like who's smarter or who's better or anything like that. It's really just about promoting Josh's work. And I think that's the whole goal of Adherent Apologetics, this whole Christian Apologetics March Madness tournament, is to basically just promote apologetics. And so we want to promote Josh. And if you find the work that he does valuable, listen to the talk today on presuppositionalism. If you find it valuable, please go vote for him. The link to vote is in the description of the video. So please go do that. Do it right now. Even if you're watching this live, like pause the video, go vote on Twitter, and then come back and keep watching. And I'm going to mention that a couple times throughout the live stream today. But anyways, Josh, let's talk about presuppositionalism, because you've actually taught a class on this, from what I understand. And before we get into that, just inform the audience a little about who you are, what you do, for anyone who might not know who you are. That's the whole point of this, is to introduce the world to Josh Rasmussen.
Okay, yeah. So I'm a philosopher. I have a beautiful wife named Rachel. That's like one of the most important things about me. You've had me on your show to talk about this book, How Reason Can Lead to God. And then since then, I actually wrote a dialogue book, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? And that's a fascinating book because it's a dialogue, real-life dialogue between me and a super smart and gifted philosopher who takes the other side of things. And one of my goals is to help expose insights about the deepest things, the things that really matter to people. And you know me, you know kind of my style is to seek to promote a productive conversation. I feel like a lot of times conversations are kind of lost in the wind of debate, and people are trying to weaponize their arguments, knock each other down. And I've actually seen fruitful conversations where people discover more on all sides. And so this is kind of my heartbeat. I feel like truth flows through the pillars of liberty and love. So people need the freedom to disagree, and they need to feel like you care about them. It's like, like truth really matters, but truth is a servant to people. And so you want to expose truth so that people can be empowered. And so that's kind of one of my core goals, is to empower people.
And if you guys don't know this, Josh has a YouTube channel, and it's called Worldview Design, where he has a bunch of cool videos on God's existence. He even has like a 20-part series laying out your kind of your basic ideas that you lay out in your book, How Reason Can Lead to God. And so I know that Cy10 Bruggencate, one of his objections to classical apologetics is that the arguments for God's existence are no good. And I think that if he interacted with your work, he might start to
he'd be
skeptical
he'd be like, wow, these are great arguments. Well, I was telling you before the show, I was like, I think of arguments as kind of like staircases, and you can think of each step in the staircase as a premise and an argument. And so, I mean, if you're kind of in the presuppositional camp and you think that you can know that God exists with just sort of one step, okay, that's fine, but it doesn't follow from that there aren't other staircases with more than one step. Whatever mechanism gives you knowledge through one step, some precepts will say it's God's Spirit will give you that sort of direct knowledge. Or maybe God's Spirit can give you knowledge through multiple steps. And that would be knowledge of an argument that leads to that God exists. And so, I mean, I've even seen Cy himself give arguments against opposing viewpoints, trying to show that they're self-defeating in certain ways. And you could think of those as multiple step arguments. I think there's been a lot of development in the philosophy and thinking about ultimate reality in academia, and a lot of it hasn't yet sort of leaked out of the halls. It's not sort of out in the popular stream, but I mean, you've seen some of this, Cameron. You've looked at some of the articles coming out even recently, and it's pretty amazing. I think a lot of people just aren't aware of it.
Right. So let's get some like a backdrop overview of the different methodological approaches that people take to apologetics. Like I said, you've taught a class on this. the different approaches. There's classical apologetics, there's evidentialism, there's reformed epistemology, there's the presuppositionalist approach. So let's get like an overview of all the different approaches and then your thoughts.
Yeah, good. So, sometimes I'll teach a course on the systems of apologetics, and it's a course really that's kind of epistemological in its nature, because we talk about where does knowledge come from. And you mentioned some of the main ones there. And kind of very briefly, you can think of the classical approach as an approach where first you try to give reasons to think or expose good arguments for thinking that reality has a kind of ultimate foundation that is supreme in its nature. This would be like arguments for God. And then once you have arguments for God, then you look more specifically at how God might have interacted with people on the earth. So you look at more kind of specific theological arguments. And this is kind of a classical approach where people kind of realize that in order to even think about history, to think about science, you're sort of interpreting the data through the lens of your worldview. And so it can be helpful to first start with the question of worldview, like what is ultimate reality like? So this would be the classical approach. And then you have sort of on the other side would be a presuppositional approach where there tends to be kind of a skepticism of natural theology, of this project of knowing God through arguments and through reason. This idea that, well, human reasoning has fallen because we're all sinful in various ways, and so we don't reason properly. And so we can't really just build our beliefs on our own reasoning. It's sort of a shaky foundation. And so we need help. And sort of God gives us help by giving us knowledge of whatever worldview is the right one. Let's say it's a sort of Christian worldview. So God reveals that to us, and that would be something that the Christian presuppositionalists would say. And one thing that I talk about in my classes is I sort of think of these, maybe it's because of the peacemaker in me. It's like I see strengths and weaknesses to all the approaches, and I think of these as almost like representing different personalities or different tools, and that you can actually find sort of the best form of each approach, and that the best form of each approach I think is actually pretty good, and that different people will kind of gravitate to different approaches based on their personality. But I find that sort of in the streets, people battle it out. It's like, well, only one approach is the correct approach. And I don't know. I guess I don't really think of it that way. Even with the staircases, I do think that it is possible to know some things through one step, but it doesn't mean that everybody knows it with one step. And I think that's where the challenge is if you say, oh, the only way you can know that God exists is if God's Spirit just sort of gives it to you while you're reading the Bible or something like this. It's like, okay, well then I guess I don't know that God exists. I haven't had that experience. So, help me, So I sort of think of it as there's different approaches and then there's different strengths and weaknesses.
I like your point about personalities, how different people sort of gravitate toward different approaches. I think that's absolutely true. I can see that in Sai a lot. He gravitated, and you can hear it in his story too, when he tells his interactions with apologetics and how he was just sort of underwhelmed by the arguments from natural theology, and so he gravitated towards this other view, presuppositionalism, which he just thought had a much more solid foundation. So I think that's really important. Another thing I wanted to point out is that I think what happens a lot in these discussions about methodology is we often place on a really high pedestal pragmatic reasons. And so this methodology, for example, if this methodology gets more believers or convinces more people to come to Christ, we want to think that, oh, well, this is the right methodology. Or, for example, if reformed epistemology kind of sounds like, I don't know, it almost sounds, what's the term, postmodern? It almost sounds like everybody's truth is the correct truth, or everyone can have a justified belief in whatever they want to believe. And so that seems pragmatically opposed to the goals of natural theology. So we want to basically appear rational. We want to appear like we care about evidence. And if we don't appear that way, like the Reformed epistemology, some people think that Reformed epistemology, and Reformed epistemology is basically the view that you don't need to have arguments and evidence for your views to be justified or rational. Actually, need to qualify that. It's the view that you don't need arguments. A lot of Reformed epistemologists think you do need evidence, but you don't necessarily need arguments. But anyways, the point is that I think what people do is they put on this pedestal these pragmatic reasons for thinking that this methodology is the best because it leads to the most converts, or it has the best effectiveness. It's going to make me look rational. It's going to make my message appear more credible. And these are pragmatic reasons, not necessarily reasons that are pertain to the truth of the matter. So what is the correct methodology, I think, is a separate question from which of these methodologies is going to create the most converts to Christianity. And so I think that that's a distinction. It's important, it's important to think about that. And I think a lot of times, excuse me, I'm still getting over this cold. I'm almost over it. So I think a lot of times we put these pragmatic reasons above the truth when I think that's a mistake. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think that part of the difficulty is that these different approaches will have different kind of versions. And so maybe some versions are incorrect. But then some, it's kind of like what happens in the contest of ideas is that you sort of begin to find the best form of your idea. And then once you find the best form of your idea, it becomes less clear if it's incorrect or if it's just a matter of sort of style or emphasis. Like, so for example, for me, what helped me to kind of redevelop my worldview was discovering the power of the light of reason, and just using that light and investigating things with it and seeing what I could see with it. And I began to discover some things. Like I began to discover that reason reveals a kind of abstract landscape of propositions, of truths, of necessary truths, and that these necessary truths don't actually depend on whether matter is stably fixed in a certain way. Because if you destroy any pattern of matter, you still get 2 + 2 = 4. And so then reason began to uncover more and more truths. And so, what I discovered in conversation with some people about some of these arguments is that some people wouldn't really have patience for thinking so carefully with the light of reason, but they would be really, really good at assembling a set of maybe historical facts that would tell a story. And then that story would illuminate a picture of reality that would make a lot of sense to them. And I would think, well, that's really good, and you're way better at figuring out sort of the right story than I am. So I want to listen to you about that. Maybe you're just better at those tools. Maybe these tools that I like so much are helpful for me. And so that's where I sort of see different people kind of working with different tools, and it's not to say that there aren't sort of incorrect strategies here. It's just, I think in the best form of the different approaches, you actually just have people working with different tools, sort of emphasizing different things.
Before we get into more of this, and we're talking about presuppositionalism today, I want to remind you to go vote for Josh. He is right now in a contest with Seitan Bruggencate on Twitter. And again, this has nothing to do with who's smarter, who's better, who is a better apologist. It's nothing about that at all. What it's about is just promoting the work of both of these guys. And I want Josh to win because he's my friend, and I think that his approach is ultimately the best approach, and I really like his arguments. And anyways, I want you to vote for Josh. So if you want to help Josh win, head over to the description of this video, click the little link over to Twitter, and vote for Josh. He's very close. He's right down. He's down in the polls right now. He's about 49%. I haven't actually checked it recently. He could be past this point, but if you can see 1,500 votes, that is a lot of votes so far. And originally Josh was really low down, and so as I've been promoting him and his work, he's closed the gap. We're almost there. So I want to encourage you to go vote for him. Well, Josh, tell me about your methodology. What is your preferred method of philosophy or apologetics, whatever you want to call it? What is your preferred method? Are you a presuppositionalist?
Well, I want to unpack that, but first I just want to point to what I think might be sort of an elephant in the room here, especially when we think of presuppositionalism, and it has to do with the value of truth seeking. And I think one of the big worries that people have with apologetics of all stripes, and we were talking about this before the show, is that there's this worry that apologists are interested in defending what they already believe rather than seeking more truth. And I think philosophers really can appreciate that worry because we love to explore. I mean, we get excited about what we don't yet see. Like, that's the most exciting thing. That's why we start puzzling over things people aren't even wondering about. It's like because we're puzzling over the things on the edges of sight. And so then often we'll look with suspicion against people who are just kind of like defending something. But then we were also pointing out that, look, am I defending the value of truth-seeking? Am I defending the value of exploring? We all defend things. I mean, everybody is an apologist. Every single person is an apologist for some things that they think are true and good and worth knowing. And so I think really it's unhelpful to think of it as apologetics versus like skeptics or something. Skeptics, my atheist friends, they will be an apologist for truth seeking, for rationality, for not having bad arguments, for science, and it's beautiful and it's good, and I love that. And so I really think it's helpful to think of not whether apologetics is a good thing, but really like how to do it well. How do you do apologetics well? And so you're asking me, my approach, and I respect different approaches to different styles. But for me, there's sort of a set of core values that I have that have helped me, because I am thinking about the practical effect, like what sort of style helps truth to flow, two-way, what style will clean up the streets through which insights are flowing instead of putting barricades in there. And I find that, I mentioned love and liberty. These are core. One of my early publications in graduate school had an argument for the existence of a necessary, eternal first cause of reality. And I had a section in there called a way out. And I didn't respond to that. I didn't say, and this way out, fails, and anybody who takes it is irrational. I didn't do that. I just had a way out. And it was interesting because later I found a blog by somebody who had a blog kind of defending, I don't know if they were necessarily defending, but they were agnostic, thinking about philosophy, and then an article on my paper. And I was very interested. Okay, what are they going to say? What's their critique? And to my great interest and surprise, they cited this paper as a reason for their newfound belief in God at the end of their article. And I thought, well, how come they didn't take the way out? Because I gave a way out of my argument. And they talked about why they didn't take the way out in that particular blog. But I think it's actually helpful for people to have that freedom and that liberty to see it for themselves, to feel like there is a way out, so that you're not trapping them into your argument, so that if they agree with you, now it's like you won and they lost. I feel like that sort of dialectical contest does get in the way of insight flow. And so my style that I find is helpful, that works, is to have conversations with real people, to make them the treasure in the conversation. So that's where the love comes in, and not as a manipulation to get them to agree with me either, but more as an opportunity for two-way information to flow. That would be kind of most fundamentally my style. Now we could talk about classical apologetics. I mean, I'm sort of classical to the bone in the sense that, it just makes sense to me. Like I just start thinking about ultimate reality. I've got reasons to think that it's not arbitrarily limited in its foundations. It has a supreme nature, and this has great predictive success. And so I've got a kind of scientific argument, but also I think you can know. I actually think that there are people that who follow these arguments change from not believing to believing, and can know that ultimate reality is good, and that there's meaning at the foundation of things, that reality is meaningful. And so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, here's a distinction that I'm thinking about that might help anyone who's watching this. Maybe you're still confused about the distinction between presuppositionalist and classical apologetics. I think that what we can all agree about, and I think, Josh, you can agree with this too, is that there is some foundation of reality that sort of explains everything else. And so logical principles of reason, and this is something that Cy points out a lot, induction, like how do you justify an inductive reasoning? You can't do it without God. And I think that ultimately you would agree with that, as God is the foundation of everything, right? And so presuppositionalists, classical apologists, evidentialists, everybody, I think, can agree with that, as God is the foundation. But I think the difference here is whether or not God is a necessary precondition for knowledge. So there's a difference here between our knowledge of the world and what sort of grounds reality. I think those are two different things, and that's ultimately where the presuppositionalist is going to diverge here, is when it comes to knowledge, things that we know. They're going to say, well, God is necessary for that. And so when you think about arguments for natural theology, that is not giving us knowledge. What is giving us knowledge is God. It's always God. It's always a Christian God. It's always Christianity that is giving us this knowledge. Yeah. But I think that it's important to point out the agreement here between the two, regardless of your approach, is that God is the necessary sort of foundation for logical principles, for induction, for everything, for science. But the difference is about what grounds our knowledge. Do we need God to sort of make it the case that we have knowledge? I think that's what presuppositionalists are ultimately getting at. And that's why you even mentioned before we went live is that Alvin Plantinga is a sort of soft presuppositionalist because he does think that God is a sort of necessary precondition for knowledge in some sense.
Well, or at least that you can know that God exists in a basic way, not on the basis of other things. But it is interesting. Once you sort of tighten up the precept, so you say that you actually can't know that God exists through multiple steps, because the knowledge of God is a precondition for knowledge of anything. Then somebody actually sent me an email one time making this point. I have my bridge of reason, which is a set of steps that lead to the knowledge of God, or at least some ultimate perfect reality. And the first step on the bridge is the knowledge that something exists. Okay. Now, Cameron, somebody emailed me. They said they're having a hard time with the first step, that something exists. They said they actually already believe that God exists. It turned out through correspondence that they thought that you couldn't know that something exists unless you first know that God exists, because this is kind of a presupp view, right? That you have to know that God exists to know anything else. And I do think that's a mistake. In fact, I was just working on a script for my next video where I talk about the foundations of knowledge and where knowledge ultimately comes from. And I would argue that you have an ability to know things directly by an inner light of awareness. So you can actually know that you exist by just being aware of your existence. You don't actually have to first know that God exists in order to know that you exist. And I mean, I think psychologically this makes a lot of sense. I mean, are we going to say that, no atheist even knows anything? They don't even know that they exist, or that 1 + 1 = 2.
Or that they have two hands.
Or that they have two hands, yeah. Now, I mean, I think the distinction you made, Cameron, was really, really nice. The difference between God being the foundation of all things versus the knowledge of God being the foundation of all knowledge. This distinction actually was the key that helped this person who emailed me to make progress there, for him to sort of see how you could know something without knowing that God exists. So let me just draw this out a bit. I think...
Let me mention that real quick. I actually first heard this from Richard Howe. I did an interview with him. He's a philosopher. I don't know where he's out of, but I did an interview with him on presuppositionalism. It hasn't come out yet. It's about to come out on my YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that. But he made a distinction between the metaphysical thesis and the epistemological thesis.
Yes.
And so I think that once he sort of set that out in our interview, which again, you're going to have to wait to see. But I think that once he set that out, it really helped me understand, because he even mentions that some of these guys like Van Til and Banson, they conflate the two in their writings, is that they waffle back and forth between the metaphysical thesis that God is the ground of reality and the epistemological thesis that God has got to be there to ground our knowledge of reality. So anyways, I think that this distinction is key.
It's key. Well, and I'm going to just draw this out again, because I actually do think that you can make the argument that without God, without a supreme mind, there wouldn't be any structure for rationality at all. So there would be no knowledge. So in that sense, God is the ultimate ground of all knowledge. But it doesn't follow from that you have to know that God is the ground of knowledge to have knowledge, right? And so, I mean, this is where if precepts conflate those two, charitably, I'm going to kind of leave it open. Maybe there's different versions of presupp there, but if you take the
explain that a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
You said that you don't have to, it doesn't follow from that, but that might not be apparent. What do you mean by doesn't follow?
Yeah, so I mean, you could think that God is sort of required to provide a kind of rational structure for reality. Even the principles of logic themselves, you might think that these basic truths are part of the basic reality. And you might think that without that, there could never be any knowledge at all. If you just have particles smashing to produce thoughts, those thoughts are never rational. They don't count as knowledge. So what you need is a rational framework at the foundation. And you could think that that's true. So you could think that you do need God to ground all knowledge. Okay, you can think that.
Let's camp on that. Yeah, camp on that real quick.
But it doesn't follow from that you have to believe, that you have to know that God grounds all knowledge for you to have knowledge.
And that's just the distinction there again between
Yes.
the metaphysical and the epistemological thesis.
Yes.
But to sort of explain that first, the metaphysical thesis a little bit deeper, I think what you're drawing here, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, because I'm thinking about connections between your work and dependence and stuff. And it sounds like what everyone, all Christian apologists want to agree with, is that all of these other things depend on God's existence.
Yeah.
So our
Including
existence,
knowledge.
the laws of logic, induction, including knowledge, depends. It has a dependence relation to God's existence.
Yes.
But it doesn't follow from that no one has any knowledge if they don't know that God exists.
It doesn't follow from the dependence relation between everything and God, that there's a dependence relation between, okay, I just want to get this really, really clear. There is a dependence relation between your knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 and God. On the sort of Christian worldview, because on a broadly theistic worldview, there's a dependence relation between everything else and God. So there's a dependence relation between your knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 and God. Okay, but it doesn't follow that there's a dependence relation between your knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 and your knowing that God exists. So my thought is that you can just know directly by the light of awareness that 2 + 2 = 4. Or maybe, to spiritualize it if you want, God's Spirit just gives you the knowledge that 2 + 2 = 4. Or God's Spirit gives you the knowledge that you should be good today, or whatever, that you should be a truth seeker. And you can have that knowledge without having the knowledge of God. Now, I mean, I think a lot of precepts will say that everybody just has the knowledge of God, and people suppress that. But that's a different issue, right? Because even if you actually have the knowledge of God, it still doesn't follow that you need to have that knowledge of God to know that 2 + 2 = 4. And I sharply disagree that all worldviews are based in circularity. I mean, so, I do like to be peaceful, but I mean, here's a place of sharp disagreement. I think that worldviews, I mean, the mainstream view, you ask, what's the kind of mainstream view among epistemologists, it's that knowledge is based on what are called basic beliefs. And those basic beliefs count as items of knowledge if they're justified in the right way. And there's different theories about how to justify them. You mentioned Reformed epistemology. There's roughly internalist and externalist theories of justification, and we don't need to go into those. But basically that all beliefs are ultimately justified based on basic beliefs, basic items of knowledge, and it's not circular. So, I mean, for example, right now I have this belief that we're having a conversation together. Okay, that belief is based on a certain pattern of experiences that I'm having, or maybe it's based on a properly functioning system or a reliable system, depending on your theory of what justifies belief. But it's not based on itself. It's not based on a circular chain of beliefs. And I think maybe what the precepts are really getting at is that there are some beliefs that are basic and in your own mind, that you have a mind with a noetic structure of beliefs. And every mind is different. Every mind has different experiences. And this is why different people can have different basic beliefs. But instead of digging in and saying, well, these are my basic beliefs, those are your basic beliefs, I just have to presuppose mine. There's actually a way of making progress by building a bridge and actually looking at somebody else's perspective and retesting one's basic beliefs and seeing if they're true, But I think I do want to say this at some point, which is I think one of the strengths of the precepts is they're recognizing that people do ultimately have starting points. Okay. And I think sometimes people feel like they have to sort of give up their starting points because they're not universally held. But everybody has their, I have a starting point that, like, I believe I had coffee this morning based on my memory. There's no peer-reviewed scientific evidence for that. It's not a universal belief that I had coffee this morning. If somebody says, prove it, and I can't do it, should I just give up that belief? Or should I just dig in and say, just check my memory? No, I have the belief, So I think that's right. But I think the worry is that if you're digging in and you're presupposing without adequate justification, maybe you're not willing to sort of see that you've made a mistake there. I think that's kind of the worry. So I don't know if you have.
So let me. Yeah. Well, what I want to do is head back over and let everyone know to go to Twitter right now and vote for Josh. Okay, that's what I want you to do. So head to the description of this video, click the little link, go over to Twitter, vote for Josh, because I want Josh to win. And basically, again, I'm just going to repeat this.
Is it about winning, Cameron? I thought it was about the truth. Do you care about?
Well, I know that you want to win.
I want to win. I told you that I want to win.
Yeah, no, but for me, what is ultimately about is I want Josh's ideas to be better known. I want his apologetic methodology. I want his arguments to be better known, and that's why I want him to win. It's not about who's smarter. It's not about who has the right arguments at all. It's really just about getting his name out there. So I want you to go vote for him. It literally takes 2 seconds. Just open it up. It's in the description of the video. Go vote for Josh. Let's make sure that he wins. And I think that there's only a few hours left. So if you're watching this live, make sure to do that. If you're watching this afterwards, then just feel free to stick around. But we are going to do some Q&A. Are you okay with that, Josh?
Sounds great.
Doing a little Q&A here. So if you have a question for Josh or for me, leave it in the live chat and just make sure to tag at Capturing Christianity while you're doing that. Is there anything else that you have to add on the presuppositionalism?
I think that's pretty much it, and I think making these distinctions are really, really helpful. I mean, even the question, like, do you have to presuppose that God exists? And it's like, well, no, you don't have to. Like, you can know things in many ways. Can you presuppose that God exists? I don't like the language because it sounds like it's not grounded in a good reason. But there are people who have near-death experiences and they encounter a being of light. They're atheists who come to believe in God through that experience. And would you say they're presupposing their belief? Well, I mean, it's not based on other beliefs. It's based on their experience, though. And so, but it's sort of a one-step argument. It's like, here's my experience, here's my belief. So that's the one step. And so I just, maybe this will be kind of my closing thought here, is I think it's just really helpful kind of before you get into the battle mode between these different systems, just to get clear, what are the different ways of articulating the systems. And I think that distinction you were bringing up between God being the foundation of everything, including all knowledge, versus knowledge of God being the foundation of all knowledge, that's a critically important distinction I think sometimes gets lost.
So someone said in the live chat, hey, red alert, Josh is losing to Sai again. So make sure to go to the description of this video and go vote for him. Josh, you're losing, buddy. It may not happen. We'll see. We'll see what we can do. All right, here's a question from Andrew Size. He says, do you or Josh think that presuppositionalists are committed to knowledge closure? Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah, that if you know something and then that knowledge entails something else, that then you know what it entails. And, I can't see, well, I guess if knowledge closure is true, I don't think knowledge closure is true, right? I mean, because I can know maybe the axioms of mathematics, but I don't know all the conjectures that are potentially provable from those axioms. Now, can you read the question again? Because it was about presupp. And
he said, do you think that presupps are committed to causal closure?
I can't see why they would be committed to that. I'd have to see, why one would think that they're committed to that, because as far as I can tell, the presupps will say that maybe there's an implicit use of this kind of knowledge closure in some of the arguments, but I can't see that the view itself commits you to that, because if the view is just that knowledge of God is presupposed in the knowledge of everything else, it doesn't follow from that you know whatever knowledge entails. So those.
All right, here's another one from epistemology. If you don't presuppose that God is real, do you presuppose that God is a potential solution to these epistemological questions? Mm-hmm. I'm actually not sure what epistemological questions they're referring to here.
So, that word presuppose, I tend to sort of be uncomfortable with it because it kind of has the connotation that it's not based on anything. And I mean, even the presuppositionalists will say that their knowledge of God is based on something like God, right? God's spirit. And so I guess I keep getting stuck on that word presuppose. Like what does that really mean? Can you just read the question one more time? So I want to give a better answer.
Yeah. If you don't presuppose that God is real, do you presuppose that God is a potential solution to these epistemological questions? Yeah,
I mean, you might think that God is a potential solution, although, potential there sort of connotes possibility. And my work, Cameron. I mean, I've got an argument for the possibility of God as a solution to all sorts of problems, where I don't even presuppose that God is a potential solution. I don't even presuppose that. So I don't think you actually have to even presuppose. I don't think you have to presuppose anything, really. You could just start with what you're aware of in your immediate experience. Like, I'm having a thought, and then you can just go from there. So I guess I would just say, to be honest, no, I don't even think you have to presuppose the potentiality of God as a potential solution.
All right, here's the next question. This one you may not be aware of because you probably haven't been on Twitter recently to look at like what people are saying. He says, is from Finding Truth. Is he aware, and I think he's talking about you, is Josh aware that people are questioning his theological beliefs based on a couple of tweets? How does he respond to them? So I'm not sure if you know what's being said here or what tweets
I have no idea.
Right. Okay. So maybe that's an exercise for later. Mm-hmm. Okay, so next one is from Epic Christ. He says, question off topic, but I'm wondering if there are any philosophical discussion about chaos and order. Could you use it to prove God's existence?
Well, so there is a question about where order comes from. And this could sort of take us to a kind of fine-tuning argument that would lend evidence to the existence of God. I would hesitate to use the word proof in this context because there are different explanations of order. On the other hand, if you sort of think of a completely mindless foundation, a completely, that word chaos is open to interpretation, but if you think of it as a completely mindless, chaotic, unordered, lawless reality, then it strikes me that it would be impossible for there to be, from pure lawlessness, laws, especially necessary laws of logic. And so there, I guess I would say that I think you can prove, in some sense of proof, I think one can know, I like that language better, that you can't get the laws of logic, necessary laws of truth, logically necessary truths from complete lawless chaos. I think that's right.
All right, next question, Aaron Baca. He says, are you familiar with Van Til's original argument? The idea is that nothing can be known by itself. God solves the problem of the one and the many, and so all knowledge is connected.
So I have to be honest, it's been a while since I've read Van Til. So, this is something I'd have to look at that argument and analyze it. So I don't really, it's probably safer for me not to say much about that without having it fresh in my mind.
Yeah, no worries. All right, next one, Aaron CM. He says, Sai and Eric's version rubs me the wrong way. However, I find Vodi Bakum brilliant, thoughtful, and winsome. What's your opinion of Vodi Bakum?
I don't know.
Are you familiar with him?
I don't know.
Yep, not familiar with him either. Sorry.
I want to say, it is interesting how there are kind of like different cultures and different languages in those different cultures because, one of the things that we were talking about kind of before we started was the epistemological frameworks. And so in mainstream epistemology, a lot of these things have been worked out in a certain kind of precision, a certain kind of language. And then you find the sort of same debates playing out in other spheres that are not really integrated with peer-reviewed epistemological research. And, that's not necessarily a problem, but it does mean that there's a kind of translation difficulty and there are different names in those different spheres. So I will say, I am less familiar with this kind of popular current, dealing with Van Til's arguments. Of course, I'm familiar with Van Til, and Frame is another one. But I think it's actually a very helpful project to take some of these kind of popular arguments and then look at the sort of latest stuff in epistemology, or even just some of the basic stuff, distinguishing between foundationalism, coherentism, the different theories, internalist, externalist theories of basic beliefs, and kind of just working through those, and then going back to the presuppositional classical, some of these debates, and seeing how they sort of fit in, because I think that would lead to a lot of clarification and progress.
That's one of the things that Andrew Moon points out, is that a lot of the contemporary the theories that are in contemporary epistemologists are defending nowadays are compatible with Reformed epistemology.
Yeah.
I know that that's a lot of technical terminology that I just threw out right now.
Yeah.
But basically what philosophers in epistemology, the study of knowledge, are working on right now, what Josh is saying is that if we look at those like contemporary theories that they're toying around with, playing with, trying to disprove, in essence, if we look at those, it's interesting to go back to our methodology, classical apologetics, evidentialism, presuppositionalism, and see how they interact. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Well, let me add something to this. So, there's been progress. So, one of the famous epistemologists is Lawrence Bonjour, and he was a kind of coherentist, which you can sort of roughly oversimplify that to everybody's got sort of circularity in their noetic structure, and he moved out of that through study and research, and so then he defended a foundationalist picture where your noetic structure is based in basic beliefs, which are themselves justified by experiences, reliable belief-forming processes, proper functioning depending on your theory of the basic justification. And this foundationalist picture is the mainstream view. And I think a lot of people don't realize that because there's a kind of caricature, Descartes strong foundationalism, where basic beliefs have to be 100% certain, and universally known by everybody, clear and distinct, or they don't count at all. But the majority view, I mean, I would say this is definitely the consensus view among those working on knowledge, is that every person has within their own mind some basic items of knowledge. And those items don't have to be 100% certain. They don't have to be universal. But everybody has basic items of knowledge that provide the foundation for the rest of what they know. And it's a very helpful frame, because when you're investigating a question, you can sort of check inside, trace your beliefs down to their foundations, and then test those foundations, get more data that's relevant to those foundations, and you can make progress. And if somebody disagrees with you, here's a little strategy for having a productive conversation with somebody who disagrees with you. Instead of just reasserting your views, explore their noetic structure, trace their mind to their foundations, trace your mind to your foundations, and then you could at least maybe come to an agreement that, okay, here are the foundational beliefs that we disagree on, and that's a form of progress. And then that leaves open a further research project to see, well, which foundational beliefs are right, I mean, especially if they disagree with each other. And so I want to kind of close with this. I want to land on this, is that the contemporary epistemologists have worked out a system of knowledge. And even though we disagree a lot about different things, like is it internalist justification or externalist, there's different theories there. There's actually a lot we've come to agree on. But we don't advertise our agreements, so people don't know that. But we generally come to agree that each person has basic beliefs. There's a difference between your inferred beliefs and your basic beliefs. And so I think that's just helpful to realize that. And that justification can be relative. What's justified for you may not be what's justified for me, because you have a different set of experiences. People like to say, well, this belief is just irrational, like simpliciter, just irrational. Anybody who has that belief must be irrational. Well, maybe not. I mean, maybe you could have a false belief that's perfectly rational for you, given your noetic context, your experiences.
One of the examples that I give with that, you can have a justified false belief, is before we had evidence of a round Earth, people were justified in thinking that the Earth was flat.
Mm-hmm.
I think, personally.
At least some of them were,
Yeah. Well, based on their experience,
probably
if you go out nowadays,
sure.
If you go out nowadays and you just look around, it doesn't appear like we're on the surface of this big globe.
Yeah,
like that's just not how it appears.
Right.
But now that we have good evidence that it is round, then that changes things.
Yeah.
But before then, it's just an example of how someone can have a justified false belief. I think people want to argue against that because they don't want to allow justified false beliefs. They want to say that anyone who has a false belief is just automatically unjustified.
Yeah. Well, here's another example. I have got a daughter named Sarah. Did you know that, Cameron?
I did not.
But you know that now, right?
Yes.
Okay, because my claim is evidence. Well, in this case, it was misleading evidence. I actually don't have a daughter named Sarah. I've got a daughter named Chloe. So anyway, it's just an example where you can make a claim that is evidence. Claims obviously can be evidence, but they're misleading evidence sometimes, right? So it could be false. I do have a wife. That's a claim that's also evidence. Have you ever seen my wife? Have you ever seen her?
I'm not sure if I've seen a picture of her.
Okay.
But I've heard her voice several times.
Okay, so you have maybe a little more evidence than others have, but
I know her name is Rachel.
Yeah, and I mean in that case, that you've got evidence again that isn't misleading in that case, and solely based on my claims. I don't know. I'm stuck on this one, but this is just an example where epistemologists have kind of worked this out. They have a theory of testimony. We don't have to kind of rehash this. We've sort of figured out that there's ways of gaining knowledge and transmitting knowledge through testimony, and that sometimes the evidence is misleading. So you can be perfectly justified in having a false belief, and that's helpful.
I want to tease that out a little bit more. Yep. You say it's misleading, but you still think it's evidence, right? So
yes.
You think that I was justified in believing that you had a daughter named Sarah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, in fact, I might have been offended if you didn't believe that, right? I mean, like, why wouldn't you trust me? So.
So the point wasn't that I wasn't justified.
Yeah.
Yeah. The point was that you can have evidence that, well, basically all you were saying is that you can have a justified false belief.
I think this is where things, I'm glad this came up, because I think people get confused on this. There's something good about truth and sort of something inferior about falsehood. There's something good about evidence. Okay. But now what if you have evidence for something false? Well, now you can tag to that evidence that it was misleading. That is to say, it was for something false. And then it's being misleading is a negative thing. So you might think, oh, well, then that's bad evidence, right? Because it has some negative feature. But of course, it doesn't follow that it's not evidence or even that it's not good evidence. It's just that because, I mean, unless evidence is the same thing as truth, so, anytime you have evidence, it's always going to give you truth. Unless that's the case, there's going to be evidence that's really good evidence, but it has this bad property of being misleading. And I think people get really confused by this, Cameron, is they think that because it is misleading, that therefore it's not even good evidence at all. And, there's all sorts of good scientific evidence for things that turned out to be false. It was just misleading.
Yeah, and we don't know that it's misleading up until the point that we discover that it's misleading.
Yes.
And so we can draw these distinctions, but ultimately it's not something that's going to be relevant to us until we get to that point.
And even when you discover that it's misleading, it doesn't follow that therefore it was still bad evidence. Like, it's still good evidence. It's just that it wasn't like 100% perfect evidence. It was on the wrong side.
Right, or there was better evidence in the other direction that you found out later.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to another question here, and we're not going to spend a whole lot more time on this, but just remember, go vote for Josh. So the link is in the description. It's real easy to do that. It takes literally 2 seconds to just click the link. Especially if you already have Twitter, it'll just open up your Twitter app, and you can just click Josh's name. So do that if you're watching. And there's only a few hours left to do this, so we want to make sure that he wins. All right. Next question is from Andrew Size. He says, and he's trying to give clarification on the. Well, yeah, he says, Presupps argue your claim to knowledge entails God's existence. If you know that any P, that implies God's existence Q. Therefore, anyone who knows any P knows God exists.
Yeah, I could see that. I wouldn't say that the Presupps need that, but I can see how it would help. Yeah.
All right, next question from Mordek 101. He says, do you think Presupp is superfluous? It must assume phenomenal conservatism / basic trust to believe God revealed me this, but then you could do the same with ordinary beliefs.
Yes, that's a very insightful question. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I tend to think about it, is like, as long as you recognize that you have some basic beliefs that are based on, they mentioned phenomenal conservatism, like some kind of experience. So for example, like right now I believe that I'm thinking about a zebra. I don't know, I just did that. And my belief that I was thinking about a zebra was based on a kind of inner experience. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But it does give me that kind of justification. So as soon as you open that up, you open up the possibility of these sort of basic beliefs being justified based on experience. Well, then you can run a 2-stage argument from contingency where the premises in that argument are justified by their seeming to be true. And I mean, if I want to kind of have a conversation with a Presupps, sometimes they'll use the kind of spiritual language of God's Spirit is kind of revealing this to me. So it's like, okay, well, maybe God's Spirit is revealing to me through the light of reason, not human reason, but divine reason, let's say, right into my mind that you can't get something from nothing, or that at least if something comes to be, it could possibly have a cause. And then you run the modal argument from contingency, or the modal cosmological argument. So yeah, for sure. That's a good insight. Very good.
I actually want to draw attention to it was a funny comment that you made on the post that I did on my Facebook page. You said, I don't know, you said, I think you just found out about who Psi 10 Bruggencate was. And I'm waiting for my Facebook page to load, but it's worth pointing out because I just want to read it out loud. Hang on. I'll find it. Do you remember what you said?
Yeah, I do, and I hope you find it and read it because it shows what's at stake, really, in this contest. Because it shows what happens if I lose. So pull that up.
I'm having trouble pulling it up.
Fine. I'll pull it up over here.
Okay, yeah, it might be easier to pull it up on your end. Man, it was so funny. It was about basically that you need to presuppose that presuppositionalism is false, and you're going to destroy him because of that.
Here, I have to read the exact line. It's important for people to realize what's at stake here. Okay, so here it is. So I have no idea what this is, but if Psi wins, I shall debate him on your show, Cameron, and utterly destroy presuppositionalism by presupposing its falsity and then dismantling it limb by limb. And I'm serious about that. We'll do that. If he wants to.
He might. Sai, if you're watching this and you want to debate Josh, I'm open to it. It seems like he's open to it too. So we could have a fruitful discussion.
He was the first one. Sai was the first one to like that comment with a heart.
Really?
Yeah. So he's a...
Sai Bruggencate.
Yeah, he's the one. Because I tagged him in that comment.
Oh, gotcha. Wow. Well, let's do it, Sai. If you're watching this, let's do it. Just reach out to me. All right, let's do the last question here. 20 Faces says, if God is metaphysically necessary for knowledge, then surely knowledge of God is the only ultimate explanation for knowledge of anything.
Yeah, so
to me, it's just going to collapse back into
the same distinction that we talked about. Yeah, right? Because, do you have to know that God is the source of all knowledge in order for you to know something, or for God to be the source of all knowledge? I think that's right. Although that knowledge closure point might be able to bridge the gap between that distinction. I think that is actually a really good insight to think about that.
All right. Well, that's it. So one last time, go vote for Josh. Link is in the description. Super easy to do. If you're watching this live, go do it right now. Josh, is there anything else that you want to add before we close this out? I mean, because you are on Twitter, but I didn't include a link to your Twitter in there in the description of the video. I guess I can do that afterwards. But what else? Yeah. Well, what else would you like to leave the audience with?
I mean, just thank you, Cameron. I mean, you're just so generous to me, and this is just a lot of fun. And thank you to your audience. I think that there's something really...
It's not just my audience, though. The point of this is to introduce you to people who may not have known about you earlier. So they may find out about you through this. And so
maybe I want to close with this. I think there's really something special going on in the world today, like at the big scene of the world. That there's a lot of insight coming forward. There's new technologies for communicating things. And I think that sometimes people will sort of corner off certain other people because of certain labels or even certain beliefs. And so you can't sort of listen to those people. And I think it's actually very helpful to think of apologetics as ultimately a defense of truth that's good and beautiful and empowering, and that every single human being does this. It's not like there's some people who are apologists and some aren't. And that it's just a really important project, and I think the key is to do it well. I think one of the reasons that it gets cornered off is that if people aren't doing it so well, then it kind of puts a bad taste in people's mouths. But what you're doing, Cameron, is beautiful, and I think that there's a lot going on that people aren't seeing in terms of how truth can flow, and from all perspectives. I mean, I think every person has truth, and I think sometimes we make enemies out of people. We have a lot we can learn from each other, and so I think that's kind of my final thought about that. I just thank you.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about Josh, head over to the description of the video. I've linked his YouTube channel, and we have Josh and I have done a few different interviews on a variety of different topics. We even did a 4-part series on the argument from contingency on the podcast. So if you didn't even know that I had a podcast, search for Capturing Christianity on any podcast platform that you listen to, and then go find my 4-part series with Josh, which I actually plan on releasing the whole thing. Josh, I don't know if I told you this. I plan on releasing the whole thing as a YouTube video. And so I might record the intro for that today. We'll see. But anyways, if you want to find out more, just search for Josh Rasmussen on YouTube, and you'll find a lot of stuff. He's had discussion with Graham Oppy on my channel, and then also on another guy's channel.
Cameron, you
just did that. Yeah, go ahead.
If I just insert one more thing here, I just think the value of intellectual humility is also really important for that personal discovery, and also for helping in that big scene of ideas that are flowing from place to place in this sort of idea conflict. I just think being willing to be wrong, be willing to see more things, and without loss of that sort of internal integrity, to say what you actually think is true, and I think that's important too. But that sometimes intellectual humility gets lost, and that's really important.
Yep. Amen. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the stream today, and make sure to stay tuned. On Thursday, 2 days from now, we're doing a live stream on Cosmic Skeptics' attempt at debunking Pascal's wager, and I've invited a philosopher on, Liz Jackson, to interact with that video. We're going to play the whole video, and we're going to get her thoughts on it. So make sure to stay tuned for that. Join us live and ask your questions there. But anyways, thank you again for watching, and we'll see you guys later.
Thank you.